Good evening, folks, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ray Reese, and I'm going to be your host for the very first public discussion in Canada on systemic racism and policing. Before we begin, I'd like to turn it over to Les Harper, who will be honoring the land.
Thank you. Normally in my talks, I actually don't do land acknowledgements because one thing that I believe as an Indigenous person, I know where I am, where my land is, and what I am. But because of this panel and the great people that we have on it, and the history of everybody on this panel, is the reason why I'm giving a land acknowledgement. Because usually when I go to other places, I'll ask the white people to do the land acknowledgement because they're the ones that have forgotten where this land is and what has happened. We know where we are and we know where we were before. And so I just want to give that acknowledgement to that. I give thanks to this land. I give thanks for everybody here for the journey that it took you to be here and the things that you've done, and your parents, your grandparents, your great grandparents for the survival of us, because we're all people that have been looked at that at some point people didn't want us to be here on this earth, and we are. And I want to give thanks for that. I want to give thanks for Mother Earth for protecting us and being with us the whole time that we've been here. And it's always been a great honor and respect to walk on Mother Earth here and what the life that she gives us and the strength that she gives us. And so that's why I'm so thankful for this panel. I think it's a great panel. It's a trailblazing thing that can be so great. And hopefully, I always believe that things should be, can be infectious, like good and bad. And hopefully these good things will keep on spreading because right now we need them as we always needed them. This is nothing new. That stuff that has happened, the things with the police and how we see how they treat this land and but we know that we need to respect this land more. And that's why we're talking about these things that we're doing right now. So I'd like to say miigwech for that.
Thank you. Chi-miigwech as well. Thank you so much, Les. Absolutely underscoring the importance of this panel tonight. I'd also like for us to have a moment of silence because not only have the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Tony McDade been incredibly impactful in the United States, but also the recent passing of Regis Korchinski-Paquette, Chantel Moore, and Rodney Levi have also been incredibly, incredibly saddening. So at this time, you'll notice on the ticker on the screen, you will see the names of other folks in Canada who have lost their lives to police violence. We'll take a moment of silence right now. Thank you so much for that. So we're at an unprecedented time right now in Canada. And one of the exciting things for me as your host this evening is not only to be in dialogue with these incredible folks, but really think about the ways in which systemic racism and policing are incredibly entrenched in our country. And so to start from the premise of exactly what systemic racism refers to, we are talking about policies and procedures that are embedded in institutions in Canada, but we also are foundationally talking about the ways in which Canada is a country that was built on racism. And that means every single system in our country, from healthcare to immigration and refugee, employment, the criminal or carceral justice system, housing, every single system is embedded with racism. That means that rights are afforded to and privileges are afforded to whites while denying those very same rights to folks who are racialized, disproportionately impacting Indigenous and Black communities. The other piece I wanted to underscore around systemic racism is that often when we talk about this term, we seldom talk about whiteness. And so a lot of the research and a lot of the documentation around systemic racism and how it works as an active epistemological gesture doesn't actually and actively look at how whiteness and white supremacy helps maintain and support the working of systemic racism. So having said that, I'm really excited and honored to be hosting this session with these wonderful folks. I'm going to move straight into our discussion because I want to make sure that we give enough time and hear people's comments as well. So I'm going to start with you, Les. So thank you so much again for your words at the beginning. And I wanted to start by asking you, in regards to your work around harm reduction, you are one of a few Indigenous frontline harm reduction workers, particularly who are working in regards to the opioid crisis. So Les is from the Saddle Lake Cree Nation in Edmonton. And as I mentioned, he is one of only a handful of Indigenous harm reduction workers on the front line of this crisis. He is also an artist, and he regularly uses his creativity to foster dialogue inside and outside of his community in the hopes to disrupt commonly held stereotypes. So it is such an honor to have you here with us. I wanted to begin, Les, by asking you, if you can speak to the fact that there's a disproportionate number of Indigenous folks who are racially profiled and later incarcerated, specifically connected to drug use. And so in your experience as a harm reduction advocate, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, the thing with the opiate crisis going on right now, it's one of the things that's been so overlooked so much in our communities that it's appalling how people deal with it. And one of the biggest numbers in the safe injection sites is Indigenous peoples going into that. But there's nobody looking at that, nobody taking that documentation of that. The Black community is another thing. Myself and my coworker Zoe Dodd, we go into Moss Park and we do just work with people, ask what they want, and ask if they want us there too, because that is their land right there. Moss Park has like over 60 tents in the encampments there, and the majority of people in there are Black and Indigenous. And the way it's looked at right now, it's not being looked at in any way of survival and the way of what, like somebody doesn't go into this way of life into a thought of being, oh, I want to do this is going to harm myself, this whatever. It's because they need something to help them to how they want to live, the way they want to live their life, right? And that's such an important thing that we need to look at and see that, right now there is, like I said, 60 tents in the Moss Park area right now. And again, the majority of those people are Black and Indigenous. What is our community doing for them? Not that much, as we look at, epidemics and crisis and famines during those times, Black and Indigenous people are not people that are looked at in a way to be helped. And that's the thing that we need to start looking at and seeing all the overdoses that are happening right now. And it's like an alarming rate. And the policing, what has happened, and the targeting of people are going there for survival. They're leaving the shelters, going to stay in a tent, to stay outside because of COVID-19. It's a lot safer for them to be out there. But that being said, you have all these things, and you have the policing going through there, harassing them, arresting them. The only people we've seen actually be arrested are Black men in those encampments. And that's something that, like nobody looks at and sees. And that's such an important thing for us as, as harm reduction workers and people in our community to see that and realize that that is happening right as we speak. Those things are people, our own people are being abused and neglected. There are women in those encampments since COVID-19 that haven't used a washroom, and that is something that we need to, look at. That it's like, why is that happening? How is that happening?
Mhm.
And that is such an important thing for us to try to find, a solution for that. And it's not through the police, they go through to those places, just, and they've driven through there running over tents, and that's something that happens, many times. We need to take a look at that.
Yeah, I think your point is incredibly it's incredibly important, because it also reminds me of something that Melissa McLetchie was talking about in our IG live series on Wednesday, where she was talking about the fact that policing really connects to so many other areas and other determinants of life. So the over policing of folks who use drugs, right, leads to a whole host of other issues that impact their livelihood, right? And so I really think it's important, because one of the things that we're, of course, we know that police brutality is a part of what folks experience, right? And when we talk about systemic racism, police brutality is symptomatic of the problem of policing, right? And I really appreciate what you're saying, because it's really speaking to the fact that it is an overarching problem. It is not just one thing. It's not just the brutality. The brutality is the state violence and the over policing of communities, right? So I think that's an incredible point that you're making. Sorry, go ahead.
One thing I just wanted to add, a lot of times it's not just the actions they do, it's the non-actions that happen too. That's what is such a big thing. I want to share a story a quick story. But actually, I talked to my mother last night about this, right? When I was 7 years old, I lived in Riverdale area. Nice area, good families, whatever. And we lived on a street that we were the only Indigenous family in the co-op, and one other Black family in the co-op. The rest were all white, right? Anyways, my mom was coming home. My mom got attacked and by a man, and she was, devastated. And our neighbors seen it. Neighbors that we still know who they are. What my mom did? She came home. She cooked us dinner. That's what my mom did. I'm 47 years old. I was 7 years old when this happened. Later that night, I seen my mom in her room crying. That's the first time I seen my mom cry. What did my mom do the next day? She cooked us breakfast and sent us to school. And that's the things, like those are the things, like we could look at that in so many different ways. Like, what could she have done? Could she call the police? No, she could not call the police. The police would have not done anything for her. Those white people that watched that happen to my mother, they could have called the police. Or they could have came out and did something, but they didn't. Mm-hmm. And those things are the stories that we all live with from that time to now and before. And that's the thing. Like I keep on hearing this thing about how people are like, are like things are boiling over and things are so like so heavy and so whatever and that, right? But it's always been like that. It's always been like so. Did the pot not boil over when my mom got attacked? Was that not enough for an Indigenous woman walking home to feed her kids? Mm-hmm. And that's something that we need to look at there. And then and I liked what you were saying about, we're talking about policing, but there's also about the thing about whiteness, right? It's like now we're in a thing in this pandemic, and now white people are scared and they're uncertain of what their outcome is, as how we've been living all our lives in these past couple hundred years under this police state.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that I think I look at every day and see that, and I see that like with people these days now, like they're all worried, and they're all like saying, I believe in this and believe that. Oh, that's horrible that happened to them. It's been happening to us for hundreds of years, and we all been dealing with it. But now they're scared because now the uncertainty is on their side too.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I appreciate what you're saying. And I mean, like you said, this is nothing new for Black and Indigenous folks. We have been surveyed via slave patrols, right, in the US and in Canada, right? Indigenous land has been surveyed, stolen, Indigenous folks have been surveyed and stolen, right? They're cultural genocide. So it's not new to us. I wanted to get your final thoughts, Les, on the relationship between Black and Indigenous communities. And sometimes, they haven't always been straightforward, and we've lost sight of each other at different points, right? And in terms of trying to gain liberation for our own people. So this particular time, we recognize, and we've always known that our histories are so very entangled within a white supremacist, settlers society. So now more than ever, how can Indigenous and Black communities work to strengthen our ties to fight police violence in a sustainable way?
Well, I think we have to look at our history and our connections with each other in different times. And like I'll think of a small thing like the American Indian Movement, AIM, and the Black Panther. They connected a lot and did a lot of work together in activism. And there's always people talking about what was great about them, what was bad about them. But that was what we were and who we are, and I think that's so great. If you look at New Orleans, the Black community there, there was Indigenous people hid in the Black community for their survival. That's something that happened there. Where the same thing happened in Massachusetts, where the opposite. The Black community hid in the Indigenous community with the Pequots, and that's something that is such that the understanding of that, how that looks and how that becomes, like how do we work together? It's like we've been working together no matter what, because we are the ones getting the negative effects of the police and the ways of that life, and that's such a thing. Like it's never stopped at any time. As much as like those movements stopped and whatever those things are, those times have never stopped. We've always been a part of those things, and we'll always have those connections and see those things how they are because of these oppressors that we have there. And like one thing I hate the word. We use these words like settler, right? I cannot stand the word settler. It's like a settler is somebody that comes down, it comes here for a bit, then leaves or whatever like that. They never left. They came here and they took the resources from us, raped and pillaged us, and they brought many people from other parts of the world and did the same thing. And so to use those words that they use, they have all the great words right now, ally and stuff like that, and those things like, you are not my ally unless I say you are. You don't have the right to say that. You don't have the right to say, from what I have experienced in my life, to say that you are with me. And that's the thing, is that with those connections with the Black Indigenous community, that's where we have those things starting from the past, and need to keep on recognizing those things and growing from those things. I think that's such an important thing.
Thank you so much, Les. Chi Miigwech. Always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you. So we regret to inform you that unfortunately, due to an unforeseen circumstance, MPP Dr. Jill Andrew is unable to join us this evening. However, she did provide me with a statement that she wanted me to read because she felt it was important that her position on this issue was on the record. So if you bear with me, I'm going to read Dr. Jill Andrews' statement. It begins, anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism is the topic of the hour. However, for those of us who are Black and Indigenous, this is not a headline or a moment in history. It is our life. Those of us who have experienced everyday systemic racism, seen family and community members killed because of it, have always known what time it is. There have been many responses to the recent Black and Indigenous deaths and killings in our province and our city. One response many Torontonians have been calling for is a systemic shift in policing, namely defunding the Toronto Police Services budget. I stand wholeheartedly with this call to action. I see this as a fundamental first step to addressing the chronic issues of anti-Black, anti-Indigenous racism entrenched within the Toronto Police Service. It is a first step in recognizing the need to divest from TPS's ballooning budget, redistribute and properly fund community infrastructure and social services that have actually been linked to shifting the trajectory of people's lives in a way that helps people thrive. We must dismantle the very institutions right here in our province and our city that have played a leading role in the physical, mental, and economic harm of Black and Indigenous lives and communities such as the legal system, policing, education, and healthcare. Torontonians must collectively rise up and commit to this work for it to be successful. It cannot only be Black and Indigenous voices and bodies on the line. To our white allies, now is the time to move your messages of allyship away from DMs, emails, texts, and private phone calls, and to place them in the public sphere. Despite your discomfort, share your allyship publicly and do so without any hope or expectation of thanks. Do so simply because it is the right thing to do. In order for change to truly happen, we must all be risking something here, not just those of us with the most to lose. This is the kind of work I wish to be a part of. While our ancestors may have wished we were well past this moment in history, here we are. As long as this work is necessary, we must all show up. Enough words and platitudes. Now is the time for action. I'm in, are you? In solidarity, Jill Andrew, a Black woman in Toronto.
Oh, good.
Thank you. So I really think it's important for us to, of course, look at the political implications of policing and systemic racism. And I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, Frances Bradshaw. Frances currently works as the Director of Operations for the Mayor of Brampton, Patrick Brown. She started in politics at 15 years old and has worked in the political system, interning in the Ministry of Natural Resources, staffing for multiple federal MPs, as well as working in the private sector. Her educational background in sociology has given her a unique perspective, helping her to launch social and political advocacy initiatives such as Voices, Calgary's coalition of 2S, trans, queer, and straight people of color, Calgary's first Black newspaper, Our Legacy, and the Mayor's Black, African, and Caribbean Advisory Council in Brampton. Creating opportunity, championing diversity, and providing a seat at the decision-making table for her community is a driving factor in every aspect of her work. Welcome, Frances. Awesome to see you and have you here. I wanted to jump right in and ask you about a controversial piece in regards to policing in schools, and that is the placement of school resource officers in secondary schools. As you know, it's been incredibly controversial. So some have argued that there have been positive impacts to SROs, while others have pointed to the perpetuation of the school to prison pipeline. Can you share your thoughts on this in regards to systemic racism?
Yeah, so I've actually been having this conversation in some of my circles and having this discussion. And one of the things that I point to every single time is I ask people, because policing in schools is a fairly new, relatively new concept. When I was in school, I'm 33 now. When I was in high school, there were no police in my schools. If you ask most politicians, were there police in your schools? They say no. So there's something that has changed in our environment that has created the thought that there is a need for policing in schools. And I think that's simply not the case. If we look at the report that the Minister of Education, Stephen Lecce, called after intense lobbying from the Black community, which I was deeply involved in, the report tied a lot of biased use of these police officers. We saw a 6-year-old get handcuffed by her feet and her hands and put in a face down position for over 30 minutes. And Human Rights Tribunal found that that was race related. Police don't have a role. I think police have a role in society, but I don't think that is in the school system. I think there's much better uses that we could be putting these police officers to. And I think there's expansions that need to be made within the policing system in better system use. So the city of Brampton, one of the things that we really lobbied for is the expansion of the PATH program, which creates mental health care workers that go out alongside with officers on certain calls. And we've seen a great reduction in apprehensions. We've seen an increase in individuals getting the right support that they need for the situation that they're in. But we need more funding for stuff like that. So I think when we're talking about defund the police, I think a large part of that conversation is not that people necessarily are as focused on the police, but they're focused on the lack of funding in other areas. And I don't think necessarily it has to be one or the other. We saw $12 million being given to Loblaws for their fridges. Yet within Black community funding from the federal government, we were offered $25 million over 5 years, which is about $5 million a year, which is about $4 a person when we're dividing it just within the Black community. So where is the real investment? And for me, when I look at a lot of the issues that our community faces, and almost every marginalized community, it comes down to economics. Economics is a key factor in becoming marginalized, not having access to housing, not having access to jobs, not having access to after-school recreation, tutoring, adequate mental health supports. You know, we look at a lot of the cases of individuals who have been killed by police, and we look at the connection between mental health for a lot of those. I think Sammy Yatimi was one of those. DeAndre Campbell was a great example of that. DeAndre Campbell had over, I believe, 20 interactions with the police being called to his home. Something was definitely different about this particular call. But the fact that a family has to use the police as a means to manage their kids' mental health challenges, that means there's gaps in other areas of the system. We are going to be writing a letter to the ministers directly asking for better oversight with the SIU. We need to hear more about what goes on with these cases and these files, because the more that we understand, the better that we can understand where we should have intervened beforehand. And we need to see better mental health supports. These are things that disproportionately affect racialized communities in the Black community. So, you know, I worry when we say defunding the police that the police model will turn into reductions. They're not going to be reducing officers necessarily. They're not going to be reducing supplies. They're going to be reducing social impact work. And that's where I see a concern. So I want to see because I think we will see a reduction in the need for the police if we increase our funding to services that are required. I'm also very cautious, though, when we talk about these services, because when we're talking about social workers and we're talking about those spaces, those have actually been very unsafe spaces for Black and racialized people and the Indigenous community. I mean, we look at the amount of children that have been apprehended. They're predominantly Black or Indigenous kids, and that is through the social work system. And so I always look at it as, for me, economics is a key factor. I did a session at the McMurtry Jail for youth, and they had run a program that had gone over a few months, and they had been talking to the youth about how did you end up where you are at. And I honestly think this is the most powerful program. I think anybody who carries any sort of power or authority in the judicial system should participate in this. Because do you know what the one key factor that every single one of those youth connected their delinquency to? Economics. It was about not having access to a job. It was about not having access to resources. They said, you know, it wasn't until I got arrested that I was told about all of these different programs that my family could have utilized to put me into basketball camp, to put me into these other spaces. And so every single one of those kids told me we needed jobs, and fair jobs. We needed fair access to economics, and we needed opportunities. So when we look at the school board, Black children are streamed at a much higher rate into non-academic fields, which reduces their options later on. We see a higher rate of suspensions and expulsions within the Black community, almost 22%, even though we only make up, this is in Peel, even though the Black community only makes up 13% of the students. So it goes down beyond policing. And I think if we see more resources put into development and growth and creating economic strength in the Black community, because we don't see white communities with the same problems, right? We don't see predominantly white affluent communities having issues with policing, because they have access to funds. They have access to the resources to help sustain. And I think it's a very in-depth conversation, but we do have to look at policing a different way.
Mm-hmm. And to your point, white communities have access to funds, and they do have access to policing, right? They're just not policed in the same way that Black and Indigenous communities are policed, right? And so, and that is the insidious working of systemic racism, and that economics is tied to social welfare, which is tied to housing and healthcare and all these other pieces that we know are so incredibly important in terms of literally liberation and survival. Right. Mm-hmm. So I think it's definitely a multi-layered conversation. I wanted to get your thoughts also, because the other day you tweeted that the city of Brampton taking action against anti-Black racism was a move in the right direction. And so how can this action, because we're always talking about action-oriented movement, right? And particularly around coalition building. So how can this action be concretized, particularly within political parties when folks are at odds with each other in terms of, philosophical beliefs, right?
Well, it's really interesting. I'm getting lots of calls now about, so what do we do about this Black thing? And they don't necessarily put it that way, but there is a lack of representation of Black and Indigenous people in the political structure. And I think it's because they don't reach out to us. Politicians have done a very, very poor job of engaging. I know when I was running with the mayor, we really did a very concerted effort to engage within the Black community. And I know people in the political realm, advisors and all that stuff said, well, Black people don't vote. And I remember the mayor, I turned to him and told him that was said. And he goes, well, have we given them anything worth voting for? And secondly, we don't go to the polling stations and say Black and voted. We just vote. So there's a presumption that we are not part of these systems. So we need to absolutely get engaged. We need to, and not just voting. I think a lot of people think, okay, I voted, and now 4 years down the road, let's see what happens. But I don't know anybody who's hired someone for a job and then left them for 4 years unsupervised. You need to get deeply ingrained and involved into these systems. So that means not just voting, that means getting a party membership for maybe all of the parties and making sure that the best candidate that best reflects your needs and your interests is brought forward on either one of the parties, so that no matter who wins, you have a say in that space. The Sikh community has actually done an amazing job of this. They've elected, I think, 18 MPs in the NDP, the Conservatives, and the Liberal Party. So they have a strong, strong stake in the outcomes in politics. And so our communities have often, been left out of the conversation, but it definitely is one area where, as a political operative, if somebody comes up to me and says, Frances, I'll give you $1,000 or 1,000 votes, I'll take that 1,000 votes every time. And those voices and the creation, what we did in Brampton, we created a Mayor's Black Advisory. And so we invited members of the community to have a direct connection with the mayor. We meet once a month on issues that the community either directs or that we need information on to inform decisions. And then the motion that we put forward at council, which I'm so excited about, is the creation of a Black, African, and Caribbean social, cultural, and economic empowerment and anti-Black racism unit. Because frankly, anti-Black racism is not a Black problem. We can't expect Black people to solve the crime that's being committed on to them. But what we do want to see is those social impacts. We want to see cultural impact, and we want to see economic impact, because that is areas that we can really, really make weight. Mm-hmm. So I'm excited about getting started on that.
Thank you so much. And I think to your point, it's really interesting because we have these conversations about systemic racism and policing. And I don't know if folks realize how incredibly interwoven and connected politics and governance is to policing, right? We would differ respectfully in our opinion because I do believe that the police should be defunded. I do believe actually that the entire system, since it's not broken, it was never designed for us, needs to be abolished. So for me, when I think of the ways in which a divestment of money would look, it is, as you say, in terms of better community mobilization. But how do we do that when the odds seem to be so intricately stacked against us because of the entrenchment of whiteness in all of these institutions that block that economic viability that we could even possibly attain, right? I hear what you're saying, so I think I appreciate the discussion because I think this is one area where when it comes to talking about systemic racism and policing, we don't often think about the connection to the political sphere, right? Actually, in the way in which it works. So I do thank you for your comments and appreciate that. So thank you so much, Francis. Thank you. So I want to move to a younger person who I'm super excited to hear from. And this is Mr. Timothy Gopal. And so Timothy is a recent graduate of the Masters of Public Policy program at U of T's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And he also holds an undergraduate degree in political science from Western University. He has worked for the federal government of Canada as well as nonprofit organizations. His work focuses on access and achievement for students in Ontario's education system, with an additional focus on higher education through post-secondary institutions. His passion for education stems from his personal trials and tribulations and then finding success in Ontario's school system. And so Timothy is such an inspiration to young people who struggle finding success through education and other aspects of life. Welcome, Timothy. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I am really excited to get your perspective. I know you have a really interesting and engaging story. And so I want to begin by asking you and talking about mental health well-being and how it impacts young people, particularly those who have been stopped repeatedly by police officers, right? And we know there has been documentation after documentation of racial profiling in Canada, right? For Black people as well as Indigenous folks. The emotional distress, the social stigma, and the PTSD that comes along with that is so incredibly visceral. How has your experience with the police impacted you?
I'm going to take 1 second to thank and congratulate all of the graduates of 2020. During this very tough time, I was a grad this year. So anybody graduating, moving on from kindergarten to the first grade, to our grade 8s graduating and figuring out high school, our grade 12 students looking to attend post-secondary institutions, and those in colleges and universities for sure. I think it's it was such a difficult time and an amazing accomplishment for so many people. So I'm going to start by congratulating everyone there. With respect to the question, I guess my first kind of thought with this question was with regard to mental health. So I went to high school in Ontario between 2008 to 2013. And I guess the word mental health or poor mental health never really existed. Within, being brought up in a Caribbean household, we were often taught that, we were often reminded of what our parents went through coming to Canada to provide better opportunities for us, and that, we didn't have it as bad as them. For the school system, I would say that they saw it as problematic behavior or social delinquency. And for the police, it just seemed like another arrest for what they felt was, quote unquote, making the world a safer place. So I think the importance of mental health being brought up is something that I'm so grateful for. It's something that I actually didn't see until midway through my undergraduate degree with the Bell Let's Talk campaign. Prior to that, I had never heard that word. A lot of young men like myself who were going through tough times would often what I call self-medicate. So the use of drugs was a big way of coping with our problems. We were raised with, very hyper toxic masculinity, and you're taught to be tough. Don't show any emotions. If you're going through things, you deal with them, and that's the way it's supposed to be. That would change a lot for me over the years, for sure. My experience with the school system and with police is often one I describe to people as extremely confusing. So I was expelled from high school in my grade 12 year. I hadn't completed grade 10 English, and I was arrested numerous times. I found that there were no strategies that were executed by the school board or by police to empower young Black, Indigenous, or POC boys or females for that matter. I guess what I would want institutional structures to understand is that the behavior that they saw as problematic is really just young males and females who are experiencing multiple issues, who don't have the tools or the know-how to cope with their problems. When the police and the school system saw as what they saw as problematic, I saw as a young, naive boy battling identity issues with respect to moving to a new city. Having a single mother raise 3 of us, it was not easy at all. What I was going through, I felt like no one really took the time to understand. I was never able really to talk about it. And most of all, I just didn't even know what I was going through. I wasn't able to internalize it at all. In fact, I didn't actually see a counselor until after I was expelled and sent to an alternative learning school. It's weird to think that a student can be arrested, suspended, and expelled before the thought of a counselor even comes onto the table or any sort of additional resources. From the school's perspective, I always say this, but I was one of 1,300 students that was affecting a safe and positive environment for others. So, their strategy for dealing with that was, well, we're going to withdraw you from school. And then when that doesn't work, we're going to suspend you. And when that doesn't work, well, I guess expulsion's the next step. So that was kind of tough. With respect to the police, I was constantly told, I was another social delinquent, a wannabe gangster that they would just, arrest. And it was only a matter of time before, and I quote what the officer said to my mother was that I would be 6 feet deep or in jail before my 18th birthday. I feel like both areas of jurisdiction failed me for a period of time. And it was only through a lot of self-learning that I was basically able to overcome some of those challenges. With respect to the healing process, I have been able to an extent. I still feel like there's circumstances with the police where I might be stopped, on the TTC for a random fare inspection, despite, one of 20 people entering the streetcar. Or when I'm flying out for a conference, randomly being checked at the airport. You can't imagine to begin to think whether or not your past, plays a role in that, or whether or not, your identity or who you are as a person contributes to those isolated incidents. Is it racial profiling or is it truly random? Is something I think about, even now. I always say I'm fortunate enough to have gone through what I went through in life. And I say that because a lot of my friends went through the same things and maybe weren't able to see it through. There's not a day that goes by that I don't think about the young men I grew up with who struggled along the way and possibly didn't make it. I think about all my friends working minimum wage jobs to get by. And I think about all the people who continuously tell me how proud they are of me and that they want to see me go on and do more in this world. I've been extremely lucky because I've had the opportunity to meet the greatest people along the way. I met people who come from all walks of life. I've had the opportunity to move to different cities for periods of time. And I've had the opportunity to put together and attend conferences that finally provide, a safe space for all of us. It's honestly, I can't imagine to say, it's the biggest blessing in the world. To all the Black mentors I had, to the friends or people I met in high school, the people at Western, the people in Ottawa, in Toronto, or even while traveling out to Boston to attend Harvard's Black Policy Conference. I'm forever grateful because those are the people that have truly helped with this healing process for me. And I hope we can do it for so many other young men and women out there who are going through this.
Thank you so much. I heard your voice shaking a little bit, and I can appreciate that. Honestly, and I'm not saying that to, put you to highlight that, but just to really underscore that when we talk about systemic racism, this is one of the things that I really want to highlight for our audience. It is so incredibly racism is so incredibly detrimental and life altering and emotionally and physically disabling to who you are, who we are, and our consciousness, right? And it's so incredibly important, Timothy, that you're sharing your story, because I always am so keenly interested in young people, the impact of systemic racism on young people, right? And you've had this incredible journey where you've been, as you said, arrested multiple times, racially profiled, probably people had determined who they thought you were without even knowing who you were, right? And so when I listen to, let's talk about stolen land, and I think of Black ancestors taken from land, and I think about all the intricate connections of the folks coming from very different walks of life on this panel tonight. This is one of the pieces I want to underscore for people, right? Is that systemic racism is embedded in so many different ways, right? And the resultant and residual impact of it rears its head in a number of different ways simultaneously, right? Those are intersectional connections. So when you think about systemic racism, Timothy, how do you position that in regards to your life and your work?
Yeah, I mean, I guess with respect to being extremely involved with policy and education in Ontario, it'll always be something that I see as, I tend to look back and see what got me to where I was and where the problems were along the way. The systemic racism, I think, is, the learning gaps that we see as early as grade 3 for young students, for Black students, Indigenous students, and people of color. Those gaps where Ms. Bradshaw talked about, kind of streamlining students in different areas is something that we know happens as early as grade 3. We have, traditionally from POCs, from Black and Indigenous communities, we have a lot of single mothers who are working long hours, who maybe don't have, the resources to come home after school and help their kids with homework and stuff like that. Systemic racism from a policy standpoint, in my opinion, is something that, is everything that we almost prevents or inhibits our ability to access and achieve what we want to. So that's how I would structure it there with respect to what I'm most passionate about.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. I wanted to also thank you for sharing your story. And what ideas do you have for how young people can continue to build coalitions and collaboration against anti-Black racism and police violence, often knowing that to put yourselves out there automatically puts you at risk?
Right.
Right?
Yeah, I have kind of a two-pronged approach to this. My first thing I'll say is, I want youth to go out and educate themselves, both through formal institutions and informally. Some of the best things I learned about myself was, through reading on my own. I'm someone who didn't know how to read that well until I was maybe 17. So I watched a lot of movies. I grew up watching Boys in the Hood. I grew up watching tons of different movies. And I basically tried to, because reading was so difficult for me, I tried to internalize what messages those movies were sending to me. What was it that was being shown and why was it so important for me to understand? More recently, movies like Moonlight, Waves, Loose, Get Out, The 13th are all movies that are so impactful and have so much to teach the youth and our next generation moving forward. I think that they present messages that were traditionally not seen in movies, and now that they're being shown, I think it's a great avenue for youth to take outside of reading, especially for those who struggle with it, because I did for a while. I know on Instagram, I'm seeing a lot of people post books and saying, like, go out and read this or go out and read that. But I can also respect the fact that, there are a lot of young men out there or young women who don't know how to read or maybe struggle with it a lot, like myself. So educating yourself both formally through schools or informally is equally important. I say the formal aspect of it because I haven't found something more empowering than being where I am now, knowing that I have the ability through positions of power to almost influence meaningful change. I don't think there's anything we've looked at in history where, federal laws or judicial rulings have marked history moving forward or moving in a different direction. When you look at Dr. King and the March on Washington, what came after that? The Civil Rights Act, you had the famous Board versus Brown or Brown versus Board of Education ruling. So I think putting more people, more young people from the Black community, Indigenous community, and people of color through the education system and making sure that they're able to achieve and they're able to get to those positions where they can really affect meaningful change. That being said, I don't want to diminish the importance of grassroots organizations or the nonprofit sector or the protests that are going on. I think those are equally important. And that was my second comment is get involved with potential community organizations or even at your local high school. Start an organization, start an initiative. I truly believe that the young men and women that are coming up are really the change we need in the world. The more people we have standing up for their beliefs and fighting for what they believe in, especially anti-Black racism and police brutality, the more of a voice we have going forward. We need people at some point or another to be heard, and that will happen eventually. Dr. King marched, for rights, basic human rights that had been promised to African Americans for nearly 20 years. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years unjustly in prison fighting for basic rights that had been promised in South Africa for 40 years. I want to leave you with this, but remember, those who fight to change poverty, discrimination, or human rights are people just like you and me. They're people who truly believe in not being let down another day. So don't let anyone tell you you're just another person falling through the cracks. You have the ability to do anything you want in this world if you really set yourself to it. And I know that because I'm speaking from experience.
Well said. Thank you, young man. Appreciate it. I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker as someone I have also worked with. So Neil Price is a writer, editor, and higher education administrator. He is currently an associate dean in the Faculty of Social and Community Services at Humber College and is the reviews editor at Humber Literary Review. And I will also say, even though this is not in Neil's bio, he is the first Black associate dean in the Ontario college system. There are 24 colleges in Ontario. And so I think that's really important because we are talking about systemic racism. And Neil is the first Black associate dean. Neil is the former executive director of Logical Outcomes, a not-for-profit consulting firm that aims to improve the effectiveness of human services work and social policy. His writing has been featured in Now Magazine, Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, Hazlitt, Canadian Art, and This Magazine. So welcome, Neil. Awesome to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to start by asking you a question that I didn't. I wanted to start by asking you a question around the pervasive denial and erasure of racism in Canada. And particularly because you've done such extensive writing. In 2018, as you know, the Toronto Police, they said they arbitrarily ended the practice of carding. This still takes place. Do you feel that there have been new levels of relationship engagement between community and police, given this pervasive denial of racism in Canada that's been incredibly impactful?
Yeah, I think you're referring to the carding, the practice of carding. I think it's really an instructive example in the sense that you can have a policy like carding come off the book, so to speak, officially, but the day-to-day interactions of those who that practice targeted continue the same way. And that's a really important point, because sometimes I think we get caught up in policy change, we get caught up in, even changes in the law. But when you talk to young people who are those who are impacted mostly by this sort of racist police practice, and you ask them about their day-to-day interactions, you see that there can be a huge disconnect between policy and practice and lived reality. So to answer your question, no. The police might be able to say that they don't collect the data the same way. They might be able to say that they don't put that information that they would collect through carding into a database. Perhaps that's stopped. But the practice of targeting someone by race, assuming that they're up to no good, coming up with a reason to stop them, perhaps it's a traffic stop, but then it turns into something else. These sort of phishing exercises that police engage in, that hasn't stopped. Everyone knows that hasn't stopped. And so you get into this weird space of the technicality of these kinds of practices being ostensibly removed or set aside, but the everyday interaction with police remains the same. Mm-hmm. And so that's sort of where we're at now with carding.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's an incredible point, an incredibly important point, because there have been, whenever we have conversations, many folks have conversations around systemic racism in regard to policing. One of the things that keeps coming up is training, right? They need more training. And as if that's sort of some sort of catch-all solution that's going to eradicate the problem that's very much entrenched within ideologies of policing, right? Do you think that race-based data collection can really be a benefit in a true sense of concretizing change within policing?
Data is only so good as in terms of what you do with it. Right? Yeah. So context, the purpose for collecting that data, who is going to have access to that data. There's this huge discussion around data sovereignty. Mm-hmm. And the need for Black, Indigenous, and racialized people who are continuously being asked to offer up this data to really ask some tough questions around its use. How is it going to sometimes be used against us, mm-hmm. Even though it's being put forward as something that's beneficial? So I think data is just one way. It's a tool. But like any tool, you can take that tool and it can become very destructive and harmful. So I think we need to be very careful about the idea that the collection of data in and of itself will somehow address these issues, particularly systemic racism. I mean, we have a ton of data as it stands.
Yes, we do.
And not just in policing, but in healthcare, in schools. There's no shortage of data, but we haven't seen to date how these systems are, if they're willing to take that data and actually get into substantive change. We haven't seen that. And in fact, the data collection then becomes a distraction.
Yep.
And my fear is that, with this call for more and more data, we're going to view that as an end rather than a means to something else. So yeah. I'm very wary around the question of data, but of course, data has its uses. And if you look at the issue of carding, of course, it was the Toronto Star and the community that really went after the carding data that broke that story, where we were able to definitively, we knew as people, as Indigenous people, racialized people, we knew anecdotally and in terms of our lives, we knew what was going on, but we were able to use the data to show definitively that we were being targeted by that practice. So,
right. Yeah, absolutely. Well said. And I agree with you completely. We've had data for years, like years and years, right? And it's only as good as structural change can be accompanied with that. I wanted to ask you, about your latest piece in the Globe and Mail. You've written extensively on racism and policing, and your latest piece in the Globe and Mail addresses some of the issues where Chief Mark Saunders fell short. It's an incredibly well-written and powerful piece. What impact and legacy do you think his tenure has had on Black communities, and specifically the perpetuation of anti-Black racism in policing?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You know, I go back to 2015 where Mark Saunders became police chief, and there was a lot of media attention to the fact that he was the first Black police chief for the Toronto Police Service. But if you look at many of Chief Saunders' actions, you very early on started to wonder whether he, first of all, embraced that breakthrough, or you know, the fact that he broke that barrier, whether he embraced, and more importantly, whether that meant he then had some level of responsibility to Black communities. And I'm just going by his actions in terms of some of the big issues. Carding, we talked about carding, the way he refused to engage with Black Lives Matter. Here's a group of young people who are bringing Blackness to the center of our discourse, and he, as a Black police chief, refuses to speak to them. So, you know, I think his tenure shows that representation is not enough. You can have Black faces and Black people in positions. I think one of our speakers mentioned or emphasized the importance of moving into these systems and moving up in leadership. And we, of course, we want that, but I don't think we can feel as though moving up and having these positions is enough. It's what you do when you're in these positions. It's your level of accountability. It's your level of integrity to the issues at hand, where you'll be assessed ultimately. And I think, you know, I wrote that piece, and I've shared my thoughts there in terms of what I think about Chief Saunders.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Neil. And I think it's a really, you know, it's an important and insightful problematic that you bring up in regards to systemic racism, because the narrative that more bodies equals better is not going to solve entrenched and sociopolitical problems that have been in systems for years and years and years, right? And so that's what I think is really important. Another piece that's really important, in addition to a lot of the things that you wrote about in that piece. So I thank you so much for your thoughts, and I look forward to more of your writing and in that sense. So I'm going to cycle now to Dr. Roberta Timothy. And Dr. Timothy is an assistant professor in the teaching stream, and she's the new director of health promotion at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at U of T. She specializes in the area of intersectionality and ethics in health work, health and race, transnational Indigenous health, and anti-oppression and anti-colonial approaches to mental health. Dr. Timothy has over 30 years experience in community health, working on resisting anti-Black racism strategy. She's also the co-founder and consultant at Continuing Healing Consultants, where she implements and teaches her intersectional mental health model, anti-oppression psychotherapy. She's an interdisciplinary scholar and health practitioner who is also a political scientist who examines global health and ethics from a critical, trauma-informed, decolonizing framework. Welcome, Roberta. Thank you so much for joining us. I am excited to hear your thoughts in regards to this topic, because given everything that folks have spoken about and everything that we know, and as Les mentioned at the beginning of our forum, this is not new. Police violence, state-sanctioned violence is not new, and folks who live in Black and Indigenous communities have known this for hundreds of years. Having said that, we are also seeing at an unprecedented rate a rise in mental health struggles within these communities as well. So I want to begin by asking you, how can taking an anti-oppression approach empower individuals in their own journey of self-identity, particularly when they've had extreme and very undesirable experiences with police. Your mic. Tafiq, I think she's self-muted, or are we muting her? Oh, we can't hear you. Oh. Roberta, if you can unmute your mic. Okay. Okay, that's okay. We're going to cycle back to you. It looks like there might be a technological issue on your end. We will cycle back to you. I wanted to, and we can open up this discussion to the rest of our panelists, because I definitely think that it's definitely connected to a lot of the different positionalities, given what we've been discussing in regards to systemic racism and policing. So we know that children are incredibly vulnerable. Francis has very eloquently spoken about that. Timothy has given his personal experience. Neil's talked about carding, and Les, of course, has talked about the opioid crisis and harm reduction. So I'm going to begin with you, Les, by asking you, we know that the resultant impacts of systemic racism and policing are very far-reaching. For our audience viewers, what do you think at this unprecedented moment in time, where do we begin and what can be done? Oh, your mic is muted.
Sorry, can you say that again?
Oh, okay. I was asking you, given that, yeah, no problem. Given our unprecedented time that we are in, right, in regard to systemic racism and police violence, there's a lot of questions around, what can be done? Where do we begin? How do we change these systems? Do we try a reformist approach, or do we try an abolitionist perspective? Right. I know where I stand on this, but I'm interested in what our panelists have to say.
Yeah, myself, I actually try to have nothing at all to do with police. I have never seen anything good out of it. I've never received anything from it that in any way, positive. I've just seen negative in the communities that I've seen, the people I care about, the people in the street be harassed. We talk about, say, oh, there's one cop is good or whatever. That to me, that means nothing. It's the thing is like, so what do we do with that? Knowing that this is a system here, I believe it's ourselves that are doing the work, and all the great panel that you have here from the different, directions and ways of connecting those things together, that we can do this together. And that's how I think things have worked through the struggles we've gone through, where looking for the answer from them, it's not going to happen. It's like try to find them to be accountable for something. They will always find a way for themselves to be taken out of the problem and making the problem towards yourself. Look at all those things, of all the killings of all the Black and Indigenous peoples. There's always some kind of things that they put on us on why it's happened. It be they had a violent past. Do they have mental health issues? That's a very big one. They always say they throw that in there. And why is that? Because that throws away from the ownership of what they are, right, and what they're doing. And there's no good out of the police system, how it is and how it will ever be. There's been hundreds of years of this system of it not working. We know it doesn't work. And why do we think it's going to work now for us? Mm-hmm. It's not. And the thing is, with this discussion, I'd like to see is look at those like I say, those allies, You know, it's like, what are you going to do about this, right? What are you going to do for us? How are you going to support us? What is it? Because we've been supporting ourselves. We've survived. We've done everything we can possible to be who we are and how we are and living the lives we are. And it's in this, you look at this right here, just in the few people here, what great, wonderful people that we have, the strength that we have, but the resilience in that and where that comes from, and we know the struggles we all have had, and just knowing each other for a moment, we know we've all gone through that. So that's not the issue. The issue is them, and what that system is, and that system needs to stop. It's like we need to stop funding the police. We are funding them. We are supporting them on that. And if any way I can find a way to not be a part of them, I try it my best. When we go to these encampments, we run into police every day. They pull up on their bikes. There are these park ambassadors, you know, like they're doing safety checks. Safety checks. What is a safety check in a park when a person, a Black and Indigenous woman, is sleeping in a park, you know, worried about her life being abused physically, sexually, mentally, all these different ways. And this is a system that we have supporting us, and they're doing it right now as we speak. These things are happening, and we need to, realize that and not have it accepted that they are going to do something about it. They never will, never have. To back to this time I was talking about my mother, to we're talking yesterday to today when we go out and do our outreach into all the communities that we work with. Those are the things. And so to look at ourselves of what do we need to do is like we are doing it. We've always been doing it, and I think we just need to recognize that a lot more, and other people need to recognize that, and that being white people being to see that, and they need to do more and realize the police system is not for us, and there never will be. Nothing can happen. You could put whoever in charge of those things. To get into those roles, you have to do certain things and be a certain thing to get up into those positions. That's why a lot of us won't be those things. We can't be those because what our hearts are, and that's the thing that I think we need to look at more.
Les,
Yeah.
can I ask you about your opinion on the blood tribe policing?
The blood tribe.
I'm from Alberta.
Yeah.
That's been...
Well, the blood tribe, they've done some really great things. Like they actually have an OPS on the reserve there, right? Mm-hmm. Which is amazing. They know what's going on there, and then with tribal police, I've never agreed with it at all. Even if there's been some good things that have helped or whatever, but they are a system that they can only do so much, and then those other people have more power. My cousin was he worked on the Saddle Lake Reserve. I used to go around with him. He could do so much, then all of a sudden the other police would take over whatever he was doing, and that was the same thing with the child and welfare system. We have Native Child and Family Services, to help us, whatever like that. But they don't have the same power that the welfare system has there to control over us. They always have more power over us. And the thing is that to think that we have that is ridiculous, I think.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you. That was a great question. Do we have Roberta back?
Hi, can you hear me now?
Okay, awesome. I'm going to cycle back to the rest of our guests, but I want to give you an opportunity, of course, Roberta. Glad that you worked out your tech issues.
Sorry.
It's okay. No need for apologies. We're live, right? And as we know, anything can happen. It's okay. It's all good. So given your background, I wanted to ask how taking an anti-oppression approach can empower individuals throughout their journey, particularly when they've had incredibly detrimental, life-changing experiences with police violence or police brutality.
Thank you so much, Ray, and good night and good evening for everybody out there and all the panelists. It's a pleasure to be on a panel with such amazing speakers. So an anti-oppression approach needs to always be a decolonizing one or an anti-colonial approach, and it needs to be intersectional. An anti-oppression approach, which by practice is action-oriented, can support the empowerment of folks to choose how they identify, where they identify, and when they identify, and do so based on their own timing and their own lens, particularly when you're experiencing acts of colonial violence, imprisonment, where your identity and your space where you walk, what you do, has been policed, surveilled, and usually brutalized. I think it is important to look here also at the backlash of identity politics and the move to sometimes hybrid thinking or post quote unquote racial ideologies. Even when we say race is a social construction, and you hear that all the time, yes, that is true. Race is a social construction, but the impact of racism is not. Being surveilled, being brutalized, being tokenized, being homogenized is the real impact of racism. And that is why it's critical to have an identity. And I would argue a Black, African, and Indigenous consciousness that is really, it's really important to have a strong identity of self. And this Black, African, or what I would say transnational Indigenous consciousness, and I say transnational Indigenous consciousness because we also, as Black people, are also from Indigenous cultures and Indigenous land.
Yes.
This includes a heterogeneous notion, right, of Blackness, of Africanness, of Indigenousness. Hence our gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, class, socioeconomic status, disability, age, religion, spirituality, immigration, migration, refugee, migrant, undocumented, incarcerated, through prison, through incarceration, through CAS, through educational attainment experiences, colonial histories, family dynamics, trauma experiences, all play into our identity. And we must also deal with the oppression that we internalize that impact how we identify and how we address our experiences of violence in our daily lives. So looking at our identity and choosing what our identities are is critical to doing resistance work. And it's critical to healing from the impact of colonial trauma and colonial violence. Resistance also, I would say, through identifying yourself and community by your own definitions is critical to emancipating your identities in this journey, and as a result empowers oneself and community. And that means you're identifying yourself in your own notion and your own means. Learning to love self has to be about learning to accept, explore, expand one's identities in one's own terms. I just want to give a quick example. You know, back in 2000s, when I was considered a youth still, wow. You know, people used to talk about women of color and people use that term, and that's really cool. I understand it's a term that people use to unify themselves. But for me, based on my African transatlantic enslaved history, it's really important for me to call myself an African woman. It is critical to my identity, to my healing, to my resistance, and also a transnational Indigenous woman. And you know, I've had so many discussions, even arguments. People were telling me you have to identify as a woman of color, as a person of color, but I don't. I don't. I identify as African woman and a transnational Indigenous woman, and having that identity is so important to myself, to empower myself based on colonial violence, trauma, etc. So we need people to identify and choose how to identify themselves to support how they resist in terms of these impacts of identities that have been trampled over based on colonial violence, imprisonment, racism, sexism, homophobia, etc.
And, you know, well said. And this is the language, how the language of the colonizer becomes normative language, right? Because then we start to use other people's terms and words to self-identify ourselves, right? Yep. And internalize that. So completely agree and appreciate your comments. I wanted to ask you, because we know that given the plethora of really brutal videos that have been circulating regarding police violence, and brutality in its most extreme forms, there are so many young people, so many children who are easily accessing these videos. And I'm thinking about and wondering about the psychological effect of not understanding the way that many of us can articulate and understand systemic racism in a theoretical sense, but they have that very visceral reaction to what they're seeing. So when we think of intergenerational impacts of anti-Black racism, and we think of the very lived reality of police violence, how do we then move forward and support our young people?
Right. I think that's a good question. I think number one, regarding the videos and in terms of the videos of, anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism, I think it's a choice. It's a family choice in terms of how you show your child and what you show your child, and it needs to be age appropriate. I think that if you're showing a 5-year-old child the video and you're not having a conversation with the children about it, it can be very traumatic. I mean, the videos are traumatic for myself to witness, and I've seen many videos, and I chose not to watch these ones particularly because I wasn't able to manage it myself. So I think the videos is something that needs to be talked about if you plan to share with your children. In general, in terms of media and children and the impact of anti-Black racism, our children and unborn children, our elders who were children, our own memories of childhood are so important for our community healing. Protecting the child is so critical, and I'm talking about the Indigenous child in ourselves and in our own and for our own children and the community's children. Black motherhood is an act of resistance. Black fatherhood is an act of resistance. Black parenting is something that is illegal. Indigenous parenting is something that is illegal. And I say this in the context of a colonial system that continuously tries to destroy, interrupt, corrupt, exploit, thief, and violate Black and Indigenous families and Black and Indigenous children on a daily basis, and historically separate and have brutalized us through colonization and enslavement. So parenting is resistance. And look at social media. Social media does not cater to Black children. Most media does not. If you look at even the cartoons, most cases with the exception of Doc McStuffin, and people can talk about that, and Motown and a few more examples, are quite Eurocentric and continue to promote white supremacist notions. And give examples of the follower. In many programs, it's one sole Black child who actively listens to the white hero or heroine, and the leader, the white quote unquote magical child, is the problem solver, right? And the hero of most television, radio, and social media programs. So the impact of anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism on children development is that children who are not supported to have Black or Indigenous positive identities will look to accept others who are not Black or Indigenous as themselves or who they want to be. So hence the phenomenon of Black children or Indigenous children with white dolls, as we see all over the place. And I am telling you, we need a Black doll, Indigenous doll campaign to change that. And imaging whiteness as better in any example results in the lack of care of Black and Indigenous children in our media. Racism is bred, and Black children and parents can experience hate on playgrounds, in schools, in classrooms, restaurants, at pools, and preference for children who are either mixed race or light-skinned, and all of the gender in terms of toxic masculinity. And I would also say toxic femininity, which people don't often talk about, is also an issue that our own children receive from parents as well as a result of internalized white supremacy. So the parents have already experienced and suffered anti-Black racism or anti-Indigenous racism, and they are triggered and also internalize that impression sometimes in terms of the response to their children. So children who have suffered anti-Black racism are often dealing with bullying, trauma, violence, and the effect of depression, anxiety, fear, self-hatred, follow fashion, which is, no boundaries, but they follow other people because they don't feel what they have to say is really critical or important. And again, many parents are being re-triggered by that anti-Black racism or the anti-Indigenous racism that their children experienced. They also need support, love, understanding, collective responses. For example, I grew up in a very, very racist neighborhood. I grew up in Galloway when it was back in the days. People say Galloway, but Galloway was we were the only Black family on the street, one of the first Black families on the street. We had feces burn in our yard. We were called nigger every day. We weren't called the N-word, so I'm sorry, I'm not saying the N-word because that's not what we were called. And we were called many, many derogatory names. And my mom, the way she responded, and she was the sole parent with 4 children who came here as a domestic worker, and she Blackified everything. Everything was about Blackness and beauty and Africa. And that's how we gained, the knowledge of self and identity, and supported with the trauma, the daily trauma of experiencing anti-Black racism, anti-Black violence. So the answer to violence against Black children and Indigenous children and Black parenting and Indigenous children is love of Blackness, love of Indigenousness, the heterogeneousness of Africanness, and continued support to have difficult conversations, trusting in your children's stories, sometimes removing them from the situation. My mom moved me from a grade 8 class that I was the only Black kid in, and she said, what, there was too much suffering, and I didn't have to be that strong, and I was very happy to be removed, by the way. And supporting supporting more public and private Afrocentric and indigenous-centric schools and programs. And it has to be private. We can't only, the public schools have restrictions and have low resources, but we also have to support private programs and lenses. And community peering and teaching healing circles is critical, are all some critical issues in terms of addressing anti-Black racism and indigenous racism.
Mm-hmm. Excellent point. As you were talking, I was thinking about the parallel between your mother cooking for you, your mother Blackifying everything, and Les's mom cooking for him and his siblings, right? Those parallel stories, right? They are so very much interwoven in terms of survival, right? And liberation and movement towards that. So I appreciate that. I wanted to ask you one final question, and that is in regard to your work. I know you're a registered psychotherapist. And how do you address systemic racism in your work specifically, particularly because it's been documented that racism is a health issue, and systemic racism, the insidiousness of it obscures Black mental health well-being. So how do you address that in your work?
I think it's an important question, and I do want to say that systemic racism, I know, is used quite often. I use it also, but I also think it doesn't even tell us the impact of what we experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I like to use colonial violence. I like to talk about not only the historical but current realities of colonial violence that actually what we're experiencing, right? And that's what is affecting and impacting our mental health.
Mm-hmm.
So Black health is intersectional, and what I call health violence is simultaneous and ongoing. We experience racist violence and gendered violence and classist violence and internalized violence and intersectional forms of violence often at the same time. Racism and colonial violence is a health crisis, and it has been for over 400 years. You know, the recent Toronto, call in terms of anti-Black racism as a public health crisis, yes, it has been for 400 years, and also indigenous racism. The impact of racism on our health is systematically killing us. We have less chances to survive and thrive based on continuous exposure of hate and cruelty. The result are higher diabetes rates, blood pressure rates, asthma. These are just some examples. Often not diagnosed until late stages of cancer. Little to no research led by Black or Indigenous researchers, particularly Black researchers, based on white supremacist funding decisions, or continued scientific racist research being supported on a daily basis. You know, people doing research on Black folks' bodies and Indigenous folks who are continuingly to create Eurocentric knowledge and Eurocentric violence. Also, lack of healthcare that represents our needs and violence from health practitioners all lead to trauma that increase depression, anxiety, and transgenerational trauma. Mm-hmm. As well, we are forced to have to have over amounts of resilience, and the word resilience actually really gets me started. It gets me fired. Because resilience is actually not a healthy thing. Mm-hmm. It's how much foolishness can we take? How much, of this all of this stuff that we need to deal with can we take? Resistance is a really important thing, I think, and I like to problematize resistance instead of resilience. Mm-hmm. Resistance is critical, and it's critical learning how to support our mental and physical health in a state of war. We're living in a state of war, and how to survive and thrive strategically, protecting our wellness is a must. I've worked with many Black folks and Indigenous folks doing activism in the community, and our mental health and physical health care has to be the priority to be able to do this work or to resist. Systemic racism or colonial violence obscures Black mental health and well-being as a social issue in many ways, incarcerating and or killing Black bodies dealing with mental health. This mental health is directly connected to racial violence and trauma. The policing of Black mental health is critical to a social issue that is based on other issues rather than racism and colonial violence. So they talk about Black mental health, but they don't talk about colonial violence and anti-Black racism as an impact. Black folks dealing with mental health are over-psychiatrized, over-imprisoned, murdered, surveilled, and not empathized with through media portrayals. Mm-hmm. The mental health programs for Black folks are underfunded or are done in Eurocentric ways. And in my personal work, I address this in several ways. In terms of, first of all, we say work, but this is life, right? It's life, it's political, it's clinical, it's familial. They're all connected. And one example as a psychotherapist, I use a model called anti-oppression psychotherapy. Anti-colonial psychotherapy is another name for it, which comes from African Black feminist praxis. And it examines the impact of racism and other forms of intersectional violence on our lives. And it supports the empowerment and healing from continued trauma in our lives. and talking to clients and working with clients and mentioning even about, how racism has impacted your life, how has sexism impacted your life, and all of these intersectional types of violence. And doing that when they've seen either been in psychiatric care or they've had psychotherapists who've never asked them about their experience of racism, their experience of homophobia. Having that conversation in general supports healing. And the second step of the approach, there's many steps, but the second step is teaching people and supporting people to support themselves in how to resist the system, how to create strategies that support healing. And healing for us is it's not the same way as white people who heal. Because I'll just give one example. I like to give this example, but it's a real example that happens on a daily basis. Most of my clients are Black, Indigenous, and racialized. You do sessions with clients dealing with depression based on, dealing with anti-Black racism, dealing with loss at work, etc. We're about to end the session. The client comes in and talks about, comes in a very traumatized stage because they were followed in a drugstore, right? And they had another act of anti-Black racism, and violence. And again, that creates a whole triggering process. And how you have to, you start the work again in a different way. So we're continually violated. So healing for us is not something from stage A to stage Z when we don't know when the blow is going to happen. So learning how to support ourselves in different ways and using different tools and techniques to empower ourselves is so critical to our healing, because we're not supposed to heal. The system is not set up for us to heal. So, doing this work as a psychotherapist and working against all of these theories, white Eurocentric theories that really not only psychiatrize us, but also increase anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism is critical to the model that I use, and is critical to the healing work that I do. And I feel blessed on a daily basis to support folks and have folks come into my office and do this amazing work.
Thank you. And we're blessed to have you on this panel this evening. And this is the intersectionality, right, of this work. And so, I thought it was so incredibly important that this panel was systemic racism or colonial violence, as you would say, Roberta, and policing, right? Not police brutality. As I mentioned at the beginning, police brutality is symptomatic of policing, and policing really is not just the law enforcement processes, but it is policing in healthcare, the social welfare system, education, housing, immigration, all of those pieces, right? All of those systems that we talked about at the beginning. So I really appreciate the fulsome conversation, knowing that the jump off for this is police violence through law enforcement, right? And really underscoring that when we are talking about colonial violence and we are talking about law enforcement, it doesn't just stop there, right? In that particular system, it is so very much interwoven in all of those other systems as well. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Roberta. I'm mindful of the time. We have about 28 minutes left, and I really want to get folks' thoughts on and also address a question that Francis posed in our chat, and that is in regard to the use of body cams. And so there have been, as many of you know, a lot of controversy and a lot of discussions around the use of body cams, and if that somehow will provide a way for police accountability, right? So I'm going to start with you, Francis, because you posed you mentioned it in the chat, and I'll lead off with you.
So yeah, I saw somebody had asked the question what our thoughts were about body cams, and recently in Brampton, we just made the decision to move forward with body cams on all policing Peel. But one of the things that the mayor and I talked about is this is not the solution. It is a part of the puzzle, but we do believe that body cams, a good cop is not afraid of a body cam. And it's been interesting because I've been talking to people within the policing sector. And the one thing with policing is it's a job that people get into for life. So we are seeing there's not as much movement towards the top of policing. A lot of officers start, at 18, 19, or when they're out of university, and they're going to be cops until they retire. And so a lot of the times the training that they are given versus the application that happens out in the field can be vastly different. And bad cops teach other cops to be bad cops. So I think having body cams is a piece of accountability, but they have to be used the right way. We've seen issues where body cams have been conveniently turned on and off at certain timeframes. We need to make sure that the use of these cameras are structured. We need to make sure that it's also used for training purposes, because I think the more that we take a look at how these police interactions go, and officers being able to sit down with mental health professionals and with people that are working in support fields to explain to them how they could be interacting differently, or how even some of these interactions could have been handled by other sectors, I think we're going to just see a lot more transparency. And it'll also very much assist in our investigations. I think people have a very low trust level for the SIU when it is, sorry, there's a bit of noise in my background, but the SIU is typically former officers who are investigating current officers' conduct. And so a lot of people don't have a faith in that system. I know with the death of DeAndre Campbell, one of the things that his family had begged for is for there to have been a body cam, because they feel that the result would have been very different. And the investigations don't need to take as long when you have an eyewitness to what is happening. And I think when we have body cams, we're going to see hopefully a reduction. I've also read some studies that say that body cams give us indicators of racism. So they can actually see, how does a police officer interact with a white individual? How do they talk to them? What kind of tone do they use versus the tone that they're going to use with somebody who's Indigenous, or somebody who is an immigrant, or somebody who is Black? And I think that's going to help us improve training and help us weed out the bad cops and get them off of our forces.
Okay. Any other any comments, additional comments?
I'm just thinking that maybe Black folks in general, Indigenous folks, should have body cams, because you know what I'm saying? It just seems like body cams are wonderful. People are turning them off, and we see that, I'm not sure if that's going to reduce the problem. I think, yes, they need to be surveilled. The police need to be surveilled,
Yeah.
but I'm not sure if the body cams, because if they're going to shoot, they're going to shoot. It's what what they're allowed to do. In a police state, you're allowed to do that. So I think if we're talking about how we deal with police, we got to deal with dismantling the police state, and we got to deal with the colonial state that exists, that gives them the power to do so. So I know this, the conversation can go many ways in this case, but I just think the body cam is not necessarily going to stop violence against our communities.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to say.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Every day we go downtown and we run into police, like I was saying, and they have body cams and that, right? And nothing has ever changed of how people are treated, and the way they're looked at. There is somebody walking across the street, a white person. They don't get stopped by that cop. They never do. It's the person, the Black person or the Indigenous person that is there. That what are they doing? How are they doing it? And this is the kind of question I'd like to ask here. Is like, is this a question? A good cop and a bad cop? Are there good cops? I don't know.
Well, I think for many folks, I give the analogy, right? If there is one person who knows, if there's a team of 12 folks, and on that team of 12 folks, one person is, is a pedophile, right? Like, and the rest of those folks know about it and they do nothing about it. You are just as complicit and complacent in that perpetration of that extreme violence. I don't know that, quote unquote, weeding out bad cops is going to change a social structural system that has been designed on colonial violence and racism, right? It's enmeshed, it's embedded. So I am inclined to agree with Roberta and with Les that I don't know how much body cams will do when we're talking about lack of police accountability. We have seen videos of cops murder people wearing body cams, and absolutely nothing has done. We can look at the Sammy Yatim case where there was video from the TTC, right? And that cop perjured himself. And if not for that video on the TTC bus, that officer would have gotten away with Sammy Youtine's what I consider to be a murder, right? I know it's, it wasn't termed that. So I don't know. I think this is, it's an important conversation to have. And I'm glad the question was posed, because there's so much discussion in regard to what do we do? We're talking about these things, but what do we do, right? So we're trying to find action-oriented solutions to combat behavior that is highly entrenched and where there is a pervasive denial of systemic racism actually working in the system. We had 2 RCMP high-ranking commissioners deny the existence of systemic racism in their factions, right? We have Doug Ford, Stockwell Day, Andrew Scheer, politicians who have never understood or even felt the scourge of racism say with unequivocal confidence that there is no racism in Canada and we're very different from the States, but yet we have some work to do, right? And offer, tokenistic apologies for having dirty water on reserves, right? Or for racial profiling in Kingston and in Toronto, right? I don't know how much leverage we can put on a body cam as a solution, one of the solution-focused imperatives in regards to the system that we have right now, right? I don't know if Neil or Timothy want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, George Floyd was murdered brutally with it. They may not have been body cams on the officers, but those officers were well aware that they were being recorded. And that didn't matter at all in that instance for those 8 excruciating minutes. So yeah, I think the body cam discussion is a distraction, and others have been pretty eloquent here in describing what we're really up against, which is a deep-rooted structural issue. What is policing? What is it based on historically? The other thing I want to point out is, I had a chance to look up the Minneapolis police manual right after the George Floyd murder. And I looked into the use of force prescriptions, and right there, I believe it's section 5311, just to get technical, there's a prescribed tactic called unconscious neck restraint. And it was horrifying just seeing that was written into a police manual. And I'm not a lawyer, but I suspect that will be justified, or at least there'll be an attempt to justify that murder by saying that the officer was following procedure. So it just reminds me about how anti-Black racism, and in this case, Black death, gets codified and written down in ways that are right there for everyone to see. How can such a procedure exist in a society that claims to be about serving and protecting? And we know disproportionately that those kinds of procedures or tactics or restraints will be used on Black and Indigenous bodies. So I really think the body cam thing is a distraction. We really need to look at how a police state functions and who's meant to live and who's meant to die in such a state.
Yeah, I agree.
That's a good point.
Timothy, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said up until this point so far. The first, I guess, kind of police incident I'd ever heard about was a young gentleman named Laquan McDonald in Chicago in 2011. He was a 17-year-old boy, and his death was, he was shot, I believe, 18 times, 6 in the chest and the rest in the back. And that was caught on a police dash cam, and the dash cam ended up getting sealed and not shown at all. So even when you introduce this idea of dash cams or police cams, body cams, whatever they may be, I think it is a diversion. And even when you decide that, okay, if this is something that we go forward with, what happens to that evidence? Is it going to be shown? Is it going to be stuff that gets shown? And if it doesn't, who's accountable then? So I think this issue of accountability, or this idea that there is a way to almost navigate what's currently going on by introducing new policies or procedures for police, I can't say I believe in it. Yeah, that's where I would.
I know the Justice Tulloch report, because you're talking. One of the things that you guys are sharing is we've seen it, but what happens with what we see? And the Justice Tulloch report on independent policing review spoke to a lot of the problems that we see at that investigative point, right? So when there's a police interaction that involves death or serious harm, it's handed over to the SIU. And there's very specific things that Justice Tulloch pointed out, which for whatever reason, these have not been implemented. To improve the transparency, to improve trust, to make sure that there's an independence from the policing institution in reviewing these cases. Because I don't think it's appropriate to have the police police the police. We need to have external eyes looking at these files from an unbiased standpoint, because I think that does play a huge role in the outcomes in some of the decisions. And we do need to be looking at how we do policing going forward. I think it's an institution that will continue to exist, but how it exists, who we're recruiting into the system. I was mentioning that rather than looking at kids who are very, very interested in getting into policing, take kids from the social work program. Let's take kids who are sociology majors, who are psych majors, who are primed differently, who have a different motivation when they're getting into the system. We have to look at who is becoming police officers and why they're becoming police officers. And then we have to spend some time on a regular basis reviewing our policies and procedures and how we're handling cases and how we're handling files. This should not be a static institution. It needs constant, rigorous review and change, if not yearly.
Okay. And perhaps that is the overhauling of the system, as opposed to the reforming of the system that we need, is to literally abolish the system and build it from the ground up. I'm thinking about Andrew Loku and Jermaine Carberry and other young Black men in Toronto who have been killed by the police and who were struggling with mental health issues. And, I don't think there's ever a situation where the police should be called, and Regis Korchinski-Paquette, right? Folks who are struggling. Why is there a situation where the police are called to resolve something that is very much tied to social health and well-being, right? Because you automatically exacerbate that situation when you bring in a law enforcement faction that is not vested in the well-being of that person, right? And we've seen this time and time again and over again. Mindful of the time, we've got about 11, 12 minutes left. There's a question for you, Les, that came through the chat.
Yeah.
And the question is, do you think the system will change for Indigenous peoples in Canada? It's a very broad-based question, but perhaps you can share your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, actually kind of going back to the question we were just talking about with the body cam thing, right? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, sorry, my computer just like it froze up there. So when one time there something happened and I was like thrown down by the police, and I had them like the police officer had his foot on my neck and I was faced onto the ground, right? And they kept on pushing and pushing on. And I was trying to ask them to stop, and they couldn't, and it was filmed, right? And so my thoughts with that is just like, do I want to have a camera that have it, or would I rather not have that cop have their neck, their foot on my neck? And so that's the thing that I think about, right? It's like from the experiences of those things, it's those we were saying, like, it's a side issue of the different of stuff. It's the system, the police system is doing that. It's that person didn't grow up saying, I'm going to put my foot on this native man's neck at some point. He was he was put into a system, and he learned that, and that system has been doing that for so many years, and it continuously doing so. And there's nothing right now that is changing that, and it will not change. And that's the question. Adding to what that person was saying is that I do not believe the police system will change. It was not set up for us. It was not set up for the indigenous community, not set up for the Black community, and it will never work for us. It was set for the white community, and that's is, there's my good friend Denise. She always says, like, there's no safe place for her, right? There's only, wherever we are, there is no safe place for us, because there is no place. You think your home is? No, it's not. Wherever you go, it's that exists. That police has that power. You could say there's all these rules that are there. We just have to try to make the safest place that we can.
Mhm.
And that's the thing, as people that are targeted, is try to make the safest place that we can. And, maybe, that is something that, that hopefully one day that system will be gone. Systems have to change, and we know that. We see that happening in society and culture. And I love it seeing young people have this consciousness of what's happening, knowing that something has to change, and hopefully they can do it, because we've been trying this for so long. My parents have been doing it for so long. My grandparents, all of us, and then that is the thing, that it's that system that has to change. It's not that person. That person is, if they're a good or bad cop or whatever, that their foot on my neck was the system that they went into that created that.
Mhm. And I think that, speaks to the point, and this is where we can have these conversations, hopefully begin to have conversations around abolitionist perspective, right? Which make folks very uncomfortable, right? Because to abolish the system, literally abolish the system of policing, means take away every single thing, every single part of that system that, as you've said, and I've said, and many others have said, it was never designed with us in mind, right? So I don't know how we can reform a system that was structurally built to disenfranchise us from the beginning, right? And abolitionist perspectives, or even a philosophy around that, really is not only about abolishing incarceral spaces, right? So prisons and jails, but it really is looking at abolishing colonial violence, as Dr. Timothy has said, within healthcare, within the educational system, right? Within immigration and refugee, and all of those systems that I mentioned at the beginning. So I want to use this, the last 9 minutes that we have, to segue into our upcoming forum in July. And that forum is specifically going to be focused on defunding the police. And I know that we've talked about it tonight. And I want to know if folks want to add anything to that conversation in regards to the divestment of funds, and really the ways in which that could create liberation in our communities for folks who are the most disenfranchised, which are Indigenous and Black people. So I'll begin with you, Roberta, for your thoughts on this.
Thank you so much, Ray, and thank you for this really amazing panel again. I do want to mention one thing before I forget. I also want to talk about people living with disabilities who are also policed. I have a disability, and I do want to say it's an important area that people don't always talk about, Black and Indigenous folks with disabilities who are actually dealing with many, many challenges, and are then again policed in a particular way. So it's just something that I really wanted to mention for us out there. In terms of defunding the police, do I think that the police should be defunding? Yeah, sure, of course. Do I think it can happen in a police state, which is where we live, or a global police world where we live? It can't be televised how that can be done. And what I mean by that is that, yes, should police be accountable for the murdering of African Indigenous folks? Yes. Can that happen in this system that we have currently? I don't think so. Is defunding the police going to stop Indigenous and African folks from being killed? I don't think so. So, I think that there's a lot of discussion and a lot of ways that people are utilizing to have this conversation about defunding. But if we really want to talk about defunding the police, we have to talk about not only defunding, but dismantlement of this colonial system. It's a whole different conversation with different strategies. And again, it can't be televised.
All right. Thank you, Roberta. Timothy.
Yeah, I would just say with regard to defunding the police, what that looks like in the community, with incarceration rates, how many, young fathers out there or brothers out there who would maybe not have to go through that system anymore. People like myself who were in and out of it, what that would look like for us and the next generation coming forward. I think that the abolitionist perspective has the ability to empower people in a substantial way for sure. And that's kind of where I see it going if it were to happen, obviously. And that's an aspect or an avenue that I would advocate for sure.
Thank you, Timothy. Frances, final thoughts?
Yeah, I think it sparked a great conversation about what we could be doing. I don't think police with less money makes police less racist. I don't think it makes a system less racist necessarily. What I am interested is, what are we funding? Where are we putting money? And I think that's where there are huge, huge gaps. It's been a fight to get dollars into the Black community, specifically targeted. And unfortunately, the majority of that is Band-Aid solutions. So fixing the end of the cause, not the root. And that economic side is critical for our communities. Jobs, opportunities, education, our pathways to sustainability and power. So I want to see less of what we're taking away and more of what we're putting in.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Neil?
Yeah, I would agree with many of the comments that were shared. I would just add that, I think we have to view defunding as a step toward abolition and not get hung up on the percentages, and the budget size. Police have been talking for quite some time about moving into more and more technology and using data and algorithms to police, which don't require as many officers. They themselves have been putting those ideas forward. So I think we have to be very careful not to get hung up on, a 10% budget reduction is not what we're addressing here. What we're addressing here is the whole concept of policing as it's been formed in a neoliberal, capitalist, white supremacist structure. So our thinking has to be fundamental to that. And then, we also have to think about notions of safety and community safety. These are concepts that the police have just taken for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's time for us to start rethinking what is public safety, and take it away from police and police officers being the ones who are defining that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Les?
Do I think they should be defunded? 100%. 100%. What I really liked what was just talked about is that one thing that we've noticed, we've been watching more police presence in the downtown area and the more poorer areas, right? And we were thinking, is that because people are talking about defunding the police now? And so they're trying to make themselves look more busier. So that's the thing. We got to be careful what we say, what we do, how it affects us. And it usually affects the people that are most marginalized, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the thing that I'm really, really worried about, how that looks like. Any actions that we do, what are the effects of that? Because they know that people are feeling this and what they want, and that scares me with how that affects people. So I think we need to be aware of that and have those eyes for that. But that being said, with Indigenous peoples, they tried to annihilate us. They tried to wipe us off the face of the earth. They didn't. We're here. And we're growing strong constantly. Our cultures are COVID-19. What's happening right now? We have a van, Anishinaabe Health. We do COVID testing every day in all the communities, and that's the thing. So that strength that we have. So that's the one thing that I think we should really look at too.
Thank you so much. Well said. I want to take this time to express my immense gratitude for each of you for sharing time and space in this forum, and to all of those who viewed our conversation tonight. This is just the beginning. And as has been mentioned, we are rooted here. We are rooted here. We have been brought here, and we are rooted here. And so one of the biggest realizations I think we can have as a Canadian society is finally acknowledging that this country has been structured, socially structured and grounded in racism. I want to thank our viewers and remind people to please follow us on Facebook and on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. I have to put that plug in there for Keep Six. Keep Six is an incredibly dope organization doing some really great work with young people and with folks who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. So thank you so very much to Tafiq for our admin support, to Agape for being on the back end, and to each of you, thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining us tonight, and to all of our viewers for their comments and their questions. We wish you well, and we will, God willing, see you soon. Take care.
Thank you.
You go ahead.
Thanks, Ray. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.